everybody. Can you hear me? 1, 2, 3. Yes. Speak up. Hey. Are we okay? Cool. So thank you everyone for joining us at the end of this amazing summit. It's incredible that we're reaching to the end. And it's a high pleasure for me to share a conversation with Molly and Larry Lessig, which they asked me to present you guys, but I don't think it's necessary in this space. So we have just 45 minutes, so I think it would be a very lightweight conversation, I guess. But I have some reflections that I really like. I have the opportunity to share you some thoughts about and to discuss about the origins of CC, what is the future of these, and more or less connecting the dots of some conversations that we've been hearing around, including the amazing group keynote some minutes ago. So I want to start the conversation about the past, talking about the past. And I have the feeling that 15 years ago, Larry, you put a date yesterday in your speech. You came out with this idea of creating a foundation at the beginning after the Android case, and then later turned out to be CC as a license, as a scheme of licenses. So I wonder, how do you see that decision back in time, 15 years from now? There's a couple of things changing. You had some idea that you want to achieve with the licenses. So I'm wondering if you can share with us, what was the idea at the end that you came out with this idea of licenses at the beginning? There was something that you wanted to achieve with the licenses. What was that?
Well, I think that the real thing that we aimed to achieve was a way of giving a name to a sensibility that I think most people shared. And that was that there was a position between the extremes that seemed to be most violently represented at the time. And the one extreme was the all rights reserved regime, which seemed to imagine a world in which every single use of creative work would be licensed or require permission in some sense. And the other extreme that seemed, or at least was represented, not to care about protecting copyrights at all. And we thought there was this obvious space of people who believed in the importance of copyright, but also believed in the importance of balance and the public domain and the need to enable the preservation and the sharing of culture. And we wanted to give it a way to express itself, and that was the motivation for finding what eventually became the licenses. And I mean, we should be clear about the history. So the organization began really when I was at Stanford, and Molly was the first, I think you were called executive director back then, was that? Yeah. And so Molly was the one sort of in the basement of the Stanford Law School who was initially crafting the plan that would become Creative Commons. And then Glenn came in immediately the next year to take over.
And our idea, although I think people now think of the origins of the organization and kind of our fundamental thing as the licenses, and then that expanded into the network and the advocacy and everything else that we now associate with CC. And that's descriptively accurate, and I think the licenses are fundamental infrastructure for sharing that we're all very proud of. But licenses, no one does anything for the good of licenses. That's not inspiring, and that was never what we were going for. So Larry's articulated part of it, of trying to create an infrastructure for this middle ground that would facilitate sharing while recognizing people's interests in copyright. But I think we had some other ideas in mind that weren't directly about copyright at all. And thinking about that, I thought it might be useful to look at our current vision statement, which I'm not in love with, and I'll explain why. It says, our vision is nothing less than realizing the full potential of the internet. And then it goes on with more detail. So I find that both intimidatingly grandiose. I mean, really, we're going to realize the full potential of the internet. That is a lot for a small ragtag organization to do. But it's also too limited, because Creative Commons isn't just about the internet. There are lots of things that are shared using our licenses that are not on the internet, and a lot of benefits that spring from what we do that aren't on the internet or are not about the internet. But I think there is something there that is about the internet that helps explain our origins. And I think that is that we want to realize the full potential of the creative spirit that is demonstrated by the internet. The internet and related developments have helped us to see how much pent-up creativity there was in the world. Or not pent-up, people were creating in their own environments and communities, but it's now on display in a way that it wasn't on display before. But what Larry and his colleagues, who were the brains behind the initial start of Creative Commons, saw was that there were obstacles to realizing the full potential of the creative spirit that was being demonstrated by the internet. And some of those were legal obstacles, and hence the early obsession with copyright.
It's interesting what you're saying, Molly, because to realize the full potential of the internet, today we have different struggles than the one that we witnessed in the past. So I wonder how that connects with our mission, which is, I agree with you, it's kind of wide and at the same time it's very strict. So I wonder how these new challenges that we're facing to realize the full potential of the internet are connected with our work. Like these people here in the room, some of them are digital rights activists, some of them are law professors, some of them are practitioners. So I wonder, how do you see that connection between realizing the full potential of the internet and the challenges that we've been facing lately?
Well, I think that one part of this is to understand or to describe what was significant or what was distinctive about Creative Commons. So if you conceive of it as just about copyright, then that's a relatively limited mandate for these other types of problems. But I actually think what was interesting about the structure that Molly and Glenn and Aaron formed originally was a particular way of addressing a policy problem in the context of the internet. So, the idea of Creative Commons was to say, we've got to express policy in multiple ways. We've got to express it through technology, we've got to express it through law, and we've got to express it in ways that humans can understand. And it was this mixed modality of policy that was the distinctive feature of the Creative Commons licenses. And if that's what's distinctive about what Creative Commons was originally, I think there's lots of contexts in which we can imagine that same structure migrating to deal with other policy problems that are out there. So we had a brainstorming session in Cambridge in the fall where we asked people who were friends of Creative Commons but not inside of the Creative Commons community to sit down and just think about what would the next Creative Commons look like. And one thing they came up with was the idea that 20 years ago the concern was how do you facilitate sharing. Today the concern is we've got too much sharing out there, not of content, but of private information. And what's the equivalent Creative Commons hack that mixes policy and technology and human understanding to enable people to regain control over that data? In a world where we understand the commercial interests are not in favor of control. Just like 20 years ago, we were enabling sharing in the context of the world which commercial interests were not interested in sharing. And I think that's an exciting way of thinking about what Creative Commons could be, so that, maybe 50 years from now, we'll look back and remember, oh, remember when we were worried about copyright issues? That was so cute. But then there were 6 other major policy areas that, we eventually became, central in. And encouraging that kind of thinking, I think, is part of what we should be trying to do.
So one way to understand your question is, what should Creative Commons do next, or what might Creative Commons do next? Another way to understand it, I think, is what should Creative Commons do about XYZ challenges out there to realizing the full potential of the creative spirit unleashed by the internet. And it's a difficult question, because the answer can't be we should do everything about everything. Because the right answer to every policy question on the internet is not self-evident, and also because we have limited resources, so we have to think about where is our real value added and where are we likely to make a difference. But I think even acknowledging that the universe of things that Creative Commons should try to do something about, say in the advocacy space, has to be limited. It doesn't need to be rigid, And it certainly doesn't need to be just about licenses, because that was never our motivation in the first place. But I think we could think at a higher level of abstraction about other obstacles to realizing the full potential of the creative spirit demonstrated by the internet. And those obstacles could be things like things that endanger the competitive environment where there are many platforms that will carry anyone's content. Things related to debates about network neutrality are relevant because we're not going to unleash the full potential of the creative spirit on the internet if people have works and licenses, but they have nowhere that will carry those works and licenses on non-discriminatory terms. So I think it's important for us to do things like articulating that. Why might the Creative Commons community care about network neutrality? Well, not just because it's something that people care about these days and because it's part of internet freedom, but because of a specific reason that we're a community that is about this creative spirit and eliminating obstacles to it, and we can imagine problems there that would be obstacles to it.
It's interesting what you're saying, Molly, because I think that one of the things that I'm eager to hear from you it's about how that success for CC looks like. And on the State of the Commons report, for instance, you can see that by today, we have 1.4 billion of works out there CC licensed. But my question is, like, what is our success? Like, what is our story of success? You talked about failures yesterday, Larry, and about how those failures help you through a bigger end. So I wonder, like, what do you think is an idea of success for a community like this, which is diverse, which is open, which is not just CC, it's like we have Wikipedians, we have Mozillians. All of this idea of the big open, I think, is connected with that. So I wonder, what do you think about it? Like, what is success for us?
You get to go first this time.
So as much as I look forward every year to the State of the Commons report and the number, I remember bragging when we got above 1 billion licensed works. That's pretty exciting, and this year's number is exciting. I have to admit that that is not a thorough measure of success. Again, because who cares about licenses? Now, that's 1.4 billion isn't licenses, it's licensed works. We do care about works. So having works out there under generous terms for sharing, that is something, but it's not sufficient to realizing even why we care about works. So we care about works as an expression of people's creative spirit, but we also care about the impact that they make on other people's lives. That's why we think that our community is motivated to share them. And so there's a next set of questions about success. Are people, in fact, able to find and use those works? So when we talk about our vision of a vibrant, usable commons that we can discover, and we have people like Paula working on CC Search to make that true, well, that making more progress there has to be part of success, because we want those works to have an impact on the lives of real people. And so that's sort of thinking about further down the life cycle of those works and their impact. But I think we also have to think about the pipeline of where do those works come from? Are we hearing the voices of people all over the world represented and all types of people represented in that set of works? And if that's not true, then that's not success either, because that's not the full potential of the creative spirit. And so partly I come to Summit and monitor and try to be part of the network more generally throughout the year in order to see what success looks like, or what the struggle towards success looks like, because it's about the communities of people. So I heard last night about CC Ghana's first salon. So that's a kind of event that could generate new works, perhaps from people that we haven't heard from before, and also new impact from people who are remixing and taking advantage of the licensed works. I met a new community member from CC Indonesia yesterday. I heard about all of the fabulous projects in biodiversity data, in open educational resources that are coming out of projects in Uruguay and Colombia at the session last night. So the impact on people's lives and the and the harnessing of the creative spirit of all types of people from all over the world. It's really those endpoints, not the middleware of the licenses in the middle. That's the crucial infrastructure that we try to help facilitate, but just building that is not what it's all about.
So obviously I don't focus on success much, but let me try. I think that what feels successful to me is when certain ideas become taken for granted, almost invisible in society. So one place that I am constantly excited by is academic scholarship, where the presumption increasingly is that we have to publish academic scholarship in a free way, using free licenses, CC being the dominant form. When we began this struggle, Jamie Boyle, one of our founding board members, one of the most important original voices in framing this, was astonished with the fact that as you would take the idea of Creative Commons out in the world, you could get musicians and photographers and filmmakers to say, yeah, this is obvious, but academics were like, no, this makes no sense. We're going to continue to publish in our old way. But now it is the case that this is like an increasingly obvious presumptive way in which people create and share, and universities increasingly insist on infrastructures that guarantee that their work can be shared freely. Even Harvard does something like this. And I think that this is a measure of success because it's a way in which the argument has become almost not controversial. It becomes part of the furniture of creativity and the sharing of knowledge. And I like to think about other contexts in which we can make that happen. And about the institutional structure, infrastructure that makes that work. So, one of my longtime dreams has been to imagine in schools children being asked to create in a way that respects copyright by using only material that's been licensed to be used. When I went to New Zealand in, I think it must have been 2011, there was an extraordinary principal from Australia who was there talking about his CC high school in Australia, where everything created was licensed under CC, and the only things that could be used would be things that were CC licensed. And as aspirational and wonderful as that was when he described it, back then it felt like, well, to make this work, you're going to need Google Images or what's the other search engine? I can't remember anymore. Bing or something, to enable people to identify content easily on the basis of licenses. And as that became more a part of that infrastructure, I think that these alternative ways of creating and sharing and respecting rights become more feasible. And I kind of want it to become almost invisible, just a part of the way we interact. And that would be, for me, success.
I've got to say, I hope Larry's vision of success that he just articulated never, ever, ever happens, because I want, and this relates to Ruth's talk and to the other policy work around the world that we've been hearing about. I want to live in a world where we still rely on fair use and other user rights, and not just on the permissions that come from licenses for school children to do creative things in school. And I think one place for us to be active in the policy arena is articulating that when people generate content that they want to share, user rights are an important part of the legal infrastructure that makes that as easy as it could possibly be for them to do within reason and without undermining copyright owners' legitimate expectations to be able to exploit their works as well. And so I think that's the best way for the potential that we're trying to unleash to survive and thrive, and that a world in which, as hopeful as I am that openly licensed works are ubiquitous so that could be possible, I hope that we don't, I hope we still have user rights to rely on as well.
So here's where I think I might be saying something that's different or maybe not. What I think is important about education is like bringing people to recognize the space they're going to occupy once they're no longer in school, right? And we could imagine a world where, people are free to use whatever they want to use whenever. And as you know, I've written about a world where the non-commercial use of content is basically not even licensable. Like it's just not copyright. It doesn't trigger copyright. That's a far distance from where we are right now. And I think that part of the project of bringing both creators and the public together is to simplify the ease with which creators can signal, I'm happy that you use my work, and simplify the practice of people, or make more regular the practice of people learning to respect or not to respect. So when we got the American Photographers Association really excited about what we were doing, it was partly because they saw that we were developing a sensibility that otherwise didn't exist, where people just thought, oh, here's an image on Google, I can take it and do whatever I want with it. And they were like, no, if you can make it easy for people to say, I'm a photographer and I'm happy that you take this and do with whatever you want. Not when you're in elementary school as much, which I would agree, I think that should be fair use, it shouldn't be regulated. But when you're 25 and you're doing a project for your work, that would be progress for everybody. It would facilitate this kind of multiple kinds of environment of creativity that I think our project is to encourage.
Good. So I think I do see your point as different than I originally understood it, but I would hope that we would still teach those school children that when you write a book review and make a quotation of the book you're writing about in order to offer a critique of it, that is where you as an adult and you as a professional journalist should be able to rely on user rights to do that without permission.
That's part of the education too.
You talk about share, Molly, at the first beginning, and I kept wondering regarding the meaning of that sharing, because connected with the first comment, a lot of things have been changed during the time. When CC started, the way that people were sharing pictures of their family was very different than the one that we use today to the same end. So I wonder, in the case of the CC project, even proving to be a successful project, either because of the amazing projects that our network has been doing, either because of the number of licenses, whatever is the standpoint that you're taking for success. I'm wondering, how does an organization like CC to avoid being overcome by the new realities that happen? Today we're talking about this, but maybe in 20, 30 more years, there will be new ways of sharing, new ways of connect with others, even new ways of creation, like the artificial intelligence, for instance, are being pushing a lot of this conversation towards the table of copyright experts and so on. So I wonder, if you think there's an issue that we need to focus in terms of how to not to become totally overcome by the new realities that the creation, the sharing culture face to us.
So I think it's hard. I think, again, the network and events like this are an opportunity to hear from people with a wide variety of expertise about what they see happening on the ground and in the world. So I'll give that sort of non-answer to the first part, that it's hard, and we rely on everyone who's part of this community to help think as far forward as we can. The question makes me think back on conversations that we've had over the last decade, and they have often focused on this notion of sharing, because we see that in a lot of places, and it does not usually, I would say, capture the vision that we have for sharing through Creative Commons. And but there has been anxiety in those conversations, like maybe we're not as important as we used to be if people are sharing using these other mechanisms, sharing their photos on Facebook or Instagram, for example. And I think as we had those conversations, our conclusion was that we need not have that anxiety about being useless and overcome by those events, because that sharing falls short of the sharing that realizes the full potential for the creative spirit that the internet demonstrates. And I think we had in mind things like, that's not the full potential because those shared resources, it's not clear that you can share them and remix them and what you can do with them. So you can look at them, but that's not the kind of powerful, creativity accelerating sharing that we think is the Creative Commons spirit at its best. I think now, things that we did not fully anticipate, but that we see now as all of the other ways that that kind of sharing is not realizing the full potential of the internet. And I think, if anything, it makes me feel that some of our ideas were ideas that were ahead of their time about the importance of distributed networks of resources that are easily portable, that are labeled in interoperable ways, that don't live only on one platform, that is subject to the whims of platform owners, subject to being hijacked by people who have other things in mind. And so all of the difficult to predict events of the last 15 and more now years, I think, if anything, have made me feel that our mission is even more critical than we realized it was. And certainly the other, as much as I enjoy sharing using other mechanisms that purport to be sharing via social networks and so forth, it is not the full potential that we want to unleash. And that mission remains more critical today than we ever realized.
Yeah, and it's harder today because when we started before Facebook. We started before any of these Instagram, any of these major Twitter, major platforms of sharing. And what they are interested in, obviously, the Google platform, the Facebook platform, is creating islands of creativity. And the islandness of their creativity is their business model, because they want you to live in their own space, exclusively in their own space, and they don't want to authorize you to step outside of that space. And when we've had conversations with them about, enabling content to be shared outside of that space, the resistance, it's been hard to measure whether the resistance is genuine or strategic. So Diane Peters and I once met at Facebook, and their biggest concern about enabling CC licenses at the core of Facebook was that Facebook needs to be able to promise people that when you turn your Facebook account off, the data disappears, and our licenses were perpetual, so the content could flow everywhere. That, of course, was before the Cambridge Analytica scandals, where it's quite clear the data doesn't disappear. But I think that the move to be made now is to at least try to enable them to see why it's important that some content easily be shareable. So, I've thought like it would be wonderful to be able to go to Facebook and say, you should enable a simple way for people to donate to the Wikimedia Commons. Like I've taken a great photograph of, Mount Rushmore, and I want this photograph in the Wikimedia Commons, and I should have a simple way of just clicking to say, please donate to the Commons. And that would be to wrap it in a CC by SA license and make it available to Wikimedia. Just really trivially easy to be able to do that. Not that all of my photographs would be available for the Commons, but that it wouldn't be so difficult for me to take that step of donation. Which is actually, if we actually think back, it's kind of hard to remember this far back, but the first project I think you worked on was the idea of creating a trust, which people would donate creative work into. So this is kind of a new form of creative trust, that if you could get these platforms to at least agree to that, so it's a simple way to move out of the islands of creativity into a common space of creativity, that would be enormously important progress, not for the purpose of getting 50 billion new photographs into our archive, but for the purpose of getting people to think about what it means to contribute to the commons, just like they think about what it means to contribute to a land conservancy or something like that.
As a symbolic way.
Yes.
Yeah. I have a last question because we have 10 minutes, and I'd like to open up the floor to the public if you agree with that. So I will keep my question for me, maybe after for the coffee I will ask you. So I don't know if there's any question from the audience. Please stand up, present yourself. So we have already two.
Hi. Do you actually think that Facebook or Instagram will ever allow you to do that? I can't see them ever giving up control.
Oh, I certainly think they could imagine doing that in an explicitly opt-in way. Absolutely. I mean, they would imagine that would affect 0.1% of their content,
Yeah.
but it would be an important win for them to be able to signal that they are supporting the commons in this way. So I think this is low-hanging fruit, and I think that they would absolutely do it.
Cool.
There's one question over there.
Have you ever considered, as a contributor, I want to contribute things that that people want, and I don't always know what that is. I'm a photographer, and I go around to state parks and historic sites, and I take all these pictures, and I put them on Flickr, and I put them in Creative Commons. But have you ever thought of a forum or a way for people to request what it is that they want to see in the Commons?
You've thought about that, haven't you, Larry?
No, never.
First time I hear this.
I think it's a really critical idea, and we've talked about a more general version of it, which is to facilitate an easier feedback of appreciation. So the idea when you post a photo in Flickr, there's a way for people to thank you in the Flickr forum, even though that forum is like 1904 technology. But there's a way to do that. But what we should imagine is a world where as your photo floats around the web, I can, in some sense, like it, and you learn that I've liked your photo, even though I've used your photo on my blog or I've used your photo on a Twitter stream or something like that. So I think that there's lots of ways in which we need to close the loop between creator and sharer or user or remixer. And I think this is part of my constant plea that we invest more in technology so that we can figure out how to make that seamless and easy, because I agree with you, that would be an enormous
And that's
step
not
forward.
connected with copyright, as you were saying
No.
at the beginning, this other thing.
Yeah, yeah. But it is part of sort of the life cycle of unleashing the power of creativity. Part of that life cycle is knowing that and having that motivation to put your stuff out there. And from what I've been hearing from folks around this room who are working on the latest technology for structured data and for identifying what's going on with that data, I think we have hoped from the beginning of Creative Commons to be farther along than we are by now in enabling that kind of functionality, but I do think that we're getting closer. And certainly being able to, part of the motivation for the whole thing was recognizing that part of the unleashed potential, that it's unleashed in part by the internet, but maybe there are still obstacles to it, is motivation to be creative because of things other than wanting to sell your copies under a copyright regime. But part of that motivation is seeing the appreciation and the needs that are being served by making your work available. So that's exactly what you're talking about.
Alec.
Hi, I'm Alek Tarkowski from Poland. I really like this thought exercise of what it means to, what's the significance of enabling free licensing on platforms. I used to think for a long time that it's not that significant in the light of the big discussions. That it was significant in 2002, but when the platforms came, I personally am still adjusting my thinking, but I get the point that this enabling of traffic outside of the island is important. But what I want to ask you, this traffic today always happens with data tracking attached. And I don't just think about the privacy angle. I think that this data is a very important also commons, right? It's for instance, information, what counts in culture, or whether it's diverse. And do you think CC can go on without taking some, and I don't know how, responsibility for this data layer, having some principles for that, having some tools for that, because we don't really have those tools beyond open data tools.
That's a good question.
So I think this potentially corresponds to what Larry was talking about earlier about using the model of the Creative Commons tripartite approach to making things have legal mechanisms and technical mechanisms and human mechanisms so that we'll understand as humans what's happening with the relevant resources. So do you have more to say about that with specific regard to Alex's question?
No, but I don't have an answer. I just agree with the motivation behind the question. I think that the data layer could also enable the sharing to link the two questions together. Could enable the sharing not in a way that's facilitating traceability to do advertisement or something like that, but just to reinforce the bonds of appreciation and recognition. I think one of the most interesting reactions to Creative Commons from the WIPO-like community was the way in which they recognized how we had surfaced the need to give attribution as associated with copyright. And of course, that was never part of the copyright bargain, but we added it to the copyright bargain. And I think that's the first half to enabling the appreciation side. So you give attribution back, and you give thanks back. And when you use something, you should be appreciative for it, especially if you're not paying for it.
We have a space for one more question from the audience. Otherwise, I will go with mine. And I don't want to. Is there any other question?
I wrote it down because it's even complicated for me to ask. So I see in this event a lot of representation from different communities of the open. Many things, different representations of type of content. And I see that CC acts as a glue in some way, right? The licenses help for all of them to work and to make sense of how they share content. So my question is, how do you see the value of Creative Commons in all of this, in these different models, given that and also given that the platforms are shaped by, platforms shape governance, right? So the way that technology works sometimes shapes the governance around it. How do you see the work of CC in that direction, and what should we do using the flag of CC in those different areas of content?
So I learned in law school about the ways that technology is governance, and I learned that from Larry Lessig, so I'm not going to try to answer that question with him next to me on stage.
And I'm not going to try to repeat it, but I do think that one of the roles that CC plays, and I've seen this played out in this amazing conference again and again, is that it's a certain context for a certain kind of reflection. So in my comments, I talked about the integrity of copyright. I think that Ruth today, in her extraordinary keynote, found this forum to be a place where you could see the recognition for a kind of integrity to copyright. And I think that same place of recognition is applicable to a whole range of issues that touch the network. And I think that what we can offer, and not we alone, but we like others, like Wikimedia and Mozilla, can offer a place where the conversation needs to reflect on values which are more fundamental than the commercial interests of particular players. Like you couldn't have an Apple conference, as great as Apple products might or might not be. You couldn't have an Apple conference and reflect in the same way about these issues because the fundamental platform is oriented differently. It's oriented towards a commercial enterprise. But this is not a platform that's oriented against commercial enterprises, not a platform oriented against copyright, but it is a platform that tries to recognize an integrity in the project that we're all aiming for. And I think that's a real opportunity to nurture that kind of platform and celebrate it. So if you bring data people in here who say, I don't care about copyright, but I care about these values as they apply to the problem that I'm thinking about, that's a moment of celebration for Creative Commons, because I think it's a recognition that there's something here that's more than just, as Molly has been trashing our licenses from the beginning of this conversation, it's more than just licenses.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'd like to thank you, Larry. Thank you, Molly, for this amazing conversation. I'm pretty sure that there's a lot of other dots that we can discuss later on. So I thank you all for joining us in this at the end of this CC Summit. So thank you all.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
As Ryan said, start and end with gratitude. I'd like to express my gratitude for how quickly you've all left the room when I've asked, how easy you've made it for our banquet staff. Thank you so much, and I'll ask you one more time. Please enjoy the summit in the hallway in the other